Hello and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm Nora. Joining me is Martin Smith, an independent analyst, author, researcher, and journalist who has reported about Myanmar since the 1980s. Thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
The Transnational Institute recently released a series of podcasts narrated by you called The Conflict Trap. Can you explain the concept behind it?
Well, the background to this is that I've been writing about the country for many years. I was first there in the late 70s and began doing this more seriously in the 80s. And while I was traveling, of course, I could meet a lot of people, veterans, people who've been involved in Burma's independence, people who've been in opposition or people who've been in the government for many years. And of course, I put that eventually into a book, and then it centered my interest in the region and on Burma, Myanmar. I am a historian by my education and background. And at that time, I realized that the country had been very little reported. It was very closed off under Ne Win's Burmese way to socialism. And I had quite a bit of experience of Eastern Europe, so I knew what closed societies looked like. So I decided, well, I'll have to put this into a book. And that's what's eventually happened. And then from the book, at that time, when there was coming out, I also did television work and so on. There was the 1988 events, and Burma went from being one of the least known countries in the world to one of the ones on the international front page of concern about human rights abuses, military government transition. So that's how sort of I didn't intentionally follow this route, but that's what happened. And I've stuck with it because Burma's been through many traumatic times. And I think as the isolation of the country dissipated, there were not only medical people, aid people, political people helping or supporting transition, but there was also still a lot of need for information. And I would say after about 2011, when the country opened up more, that special need that maybe foreigners had been privileged that they could travel where Burmese people very often couldn't, and unless they really were secure wherever they went, whether it was in the government area, opposition area, wherever you went, you had to be very secure. And so when the events of 2021 happened, a new generation came up, and a lot of young people started asking questions, but they were different. They weren't like the earlier generation say, please, can you tell us what's going on, what we should do? No, they just wanted to learn more about their history, draw their own conclusions and move on. And I began to get asked quite a lot by young people to reflect on some of these earlier things, especially anecdotally. They didn't want long analysis. They wanted anecdotes, explanations, knowledge about who people were. And it was out of that, with the Transnational Institute and also with some of the young people, they requested me, well, could you just talk about this and do a podcast? And that was made into a podcast series. So that was really how it all came about. I hadn't planned it, but actually it came in response to questions to just talk about that. And it allowed me to talk about some of the concepts like conflict trap, insurgency as a way of life, frozen conflicts, about the peace process, many of these things I've written about. So that is what the podcast series is all about.
Mm-hmm. As a writer, how do you feel about using the medium of audio to share these stories with the new generation?
It's a very good question, because we in the media have to remain on our toes all the time about the changing media and what works and the changing generations. So I can just mention one funny thing is that older people tend not to want music breaking up what is being said, whereas I'm told younger people like the music. So they find it interesting and it breaks up the thing into smaller sound bites, whereas older people often like to listen to something at length without distractions. So you can get something simple like that. I think that not simply Burma, Myanmar, the whole world, as we're now seeing in international events, is being changed by the way media is reported. When I started, it was very much the old-fashioned media where you had, people like the BBC being sort of worldwide oracles on what was happening regarded as independence, and you had the standard media, whereas a country like Burma had no media. And then, of course, in the 90s, social media began to spread digital media. And of course, since the last decade, it's exploded, and you have these paradoxes, whereas many people in the West now are fairly cautious about big social media groups like X or Facebook because of who owns them and how they're being used. whereas you find a country like Myanmar went from having no internet to having Facebook. Facebook became the medium. So for journalists and so on, we have to remain on our toes all the time. And I would say podcasts have not only become a phenomenon in Burma, but also in the West. A lot of journalists now, that's how they make their living. If they're successful, they can make a very good living out of podcasts, whereas the mainstream media is struggling. My only personal comment is that while I do enjoy podcasts, I do worry that it's very easy to appear clever in a podcast. It's commentaries. And as a journalist, you learn very early on that, commentary is cheap, fact is expensive. It's very easy to have an opinion, very difficult if you have to go out at the front line, out into the field, do your research, understand from the people. So one of the things, certainly Transnational Institute and a lot of the groups in Burma are very keen on working at the grassroots, not having top-down approaches to discussing the problems. They really think it's important that voices on the ground can be heard, and that's indeed where digital media is very effective.
Mm-hmm. You have written a tremendous amount about Myanmar over the last 40 years. What is it that first drew you to the country?
That's a very good question. It's the question I probably get asked the most, and I wouldn't say there's any particular event about Burma in a more general sense. In a personal sense, when I was a student, there was a famous British journalist called Adrian Cowell, who later I met and indeed became a very good friend, very, very helpful. And in the 1960s and 70s, Adrian was one of the few people who, as a journalist, had gone into Burma with a film crew, and he spent a long time in the country. He even got trapped in Shan State for about 18 months. And his documentaries, there was a trilogy about the opium trade, and that was shown on British television when I was a student. So I think that did actually register a mark. And then what, of course, drew me more was that my wife and I were visiting in 1977, and we were on a train going up to Taungoo, and there was an elderly gentleman in the train carriage, and he pointed out of the window and he said, up in the hills there, the Karens live, and they've got their own prime minister. And I remember thinking, well, this is a one-party state under military rule. How can the Karens have their own prime minister? So in the early 80s, when I was actually, turning to becoming a journalist, and I was in that region, I revisited that. And in 1982, indeed, I visited Karenni, Kaya State, and made a long trip there. And I was able to see for the first time the realities that there was a kind of mythical Burma, which was the Burmese way to socialism, a fascist Disneyland, some people called it. Don't believe anything you see, because it was just a one-party state which controlled the center of the country. And I was able to visit other parts of the country, seeing how the trade worked, how people were suffering, how people survived, how people were desperate for change. And, it's very sad to reflect that 40 years later, that kind of basic fundamental problem of conflict resolution, peace, inclusion for all people's representation has still not been solved, except the desire for the people is so strong and the spirit has never gone away.
Your book, Burma, Insurgency and the Politics of Ethnicity, has been regarded as a quintessential read on Myanmar and its ethnic nationalities. How long did it take you to write the book?
It took actually much longer than I expected. It took I would say, in total, nearly a decade. But it was actually finished in 1988. And then the democracy uprising happened. So that postponed it for a few years. The Communist Party of Burma collapsed. There was a general election. There were many reasons not to bring out a book which was trying to be comprehensive. It was really trying to map all the conflicts, all of the history of Burma. So it took me a long time. I should also say that, I am a historian. I did a lot of studies in historiography when I was young. And so piecing together evidence, doing research, even archaeology was something I was familiar with. What I didn't expect in Burma was that everything was anecdote. I remember, many years later meeting somebody from the World Bank, and I was saying, look, my writing's taking a long time because there is no books. There's nothing you can go to. And the World Bank person said, well, don't worry, it's the same for us. The economy's all anecdote as well. And what I mean by that is that if you went to a Karen area, you'd hear a Karen history. If you went to a Mon area, you'd hear Mon history. You go to Arakan, you hear an Arakan history. And I realized that people weren't able to communicate. They knew they were suffering the same, but their realities were different. So if you started looking into any one movement, the trouble was really in the detail. And I was able to talk with older people like Dua Zor Rip, who was a Kachin person at Panglong. He was one of the signatories. And he said this was one of the fundamental problems. He said that in 1947, when they signed the Panglong Agreement, people didn't know well about each other. And he said it was still the case. You know, the Kachin people might be suffering and the Karen people might be suffering, but they wouldn't necessarily know or realize they're experiencing the same things. And of course, when you've had this militarized state, under General Ne Win especially, who've tried to impose a unitary system on the country, it's been very difficult to have that local self-expression and communication. I would say the communication is better now, but the political troubles, the conflict intensity is even higher as people try and solve these problems. And it's, as I talk about in the podcast, it's a real tragedy that the issues weren't solved at independence in 1948. People, you know, like Dua Zor Rip, and the old Karen leaders like Thardin, Alfonso Somient, the Mon, Nai Shui Jin, there were many of them, felt, well, we should have been the ones to solve this. Because we couldn't, everything got much worse afterwards. So that was the sort of thing which drew my interest to history. And during the 80s, I conducted my research over a number of years.
Did you come across any interesting or memorable stories while researching the book?
Well, there were many. I could start with one purely because it might seem surprising, but it was actually when I was on that Karenni trip. I knew about the conflict, knew about war, I knew what war looked like, but it wasn't that which really grabbed my interest. One day, one of the Karenni officers said, look, today I'm going to interview everybody that passes us on the road. A road through the hills, going to the Thai border. And every one of those interviews was a hardship story about economics. These were people driving cattle, people carrying Buddhas, you know, to sell, and they were coming back with medicine or even bicycles and things like this. And I realized that although the military was trying to suppress the whole country, the people were suffering and they were trading and they were becoming illegal. But those people were not illegal people. They were people who needed money for medicine for their families. So all they could do was walk across the hills and go to Thailand and sell something and come back. And that really made me understand that, you know, conflict is a way of life. Conflict can be very structured and the people suffer. They have to adapt. So strangely enough, it was that experience of talking to people and realizing that struggle. And it's what I see today. People are very adept. People have learnt survival, subsistence, and the generals have got away with it all these years because Burma does have a lot of resources. It has jade, it has rare earths, it has timber, it has many things which they're profiting off. And actually the whole country should be benefiting. The state should be benefiting, but instead everything's just being exploited. So yes, I mean that would be a starting point story, and that was at that moment I realized I had to follow this closer. And I would say that about 2 or 3 years later, I came into another thing, by which time I'd reported on the conflict and had seen more of the war zones and the conflict zones. And I had another experience at that time, again, when I realized that more people were dying of preventable and treatable illnesses like malaria and TB than were dying in conflict, or maternal and child mortality rate was incredibly high. And I was thinking we have to have a broader understanding of conflict or politics. We have to look at the health rights, the human rights, the education rights. It's a much broader tragedy that's been inflicted on the country than simply civil war. It's much more than that. And that's what the sort of things which have driven my research. And that's why I tend to write at length. I tend not to write short things because I always find there's quite a lot to say.
How have you been able to follow developments in Myanmar throughout the previous 4 decades?
Well, many different ways, a lot of imagination, a lot of different trips, a lot of different things. So I've had a lot of different experiences. And all of these experiences have taken me to different parts of the country and on different sides of the conflict lines. You know, a few years ago, I was at one within a few months, I was on one side of the China border, and then a few months later, I was on the other side of the China border, and that was an interesting experience as well. I was with the Burmese government person, and he looked from Musée across to Ruli with all its tower blocks and things like this. And there was Musée, and he looked at China and he just said, Singapore, because he was so impressed by all the tower blocks and the buildings and so on like that. So I've had different experiences doing different things. I had a lot of experience in the country when I was, for 6 years, I was an independent expert member of the Three Diseases Fund, which was after the Global Fund pulled out of Burma. Donors realized that, well, you might have a bad government in Burma, but people still suffer from malaria, TB, HIV. So another project had to be set up, and to find ways of working in Burma without being, just under the government. So that was the Three Diseases Fund, and so I got a lot of exposure and experience in the country at that time, and it just lots of different trips. So I'm extremely fortunate in that respect.
Since the 2021 military coup, have you changed your perspective on the country and its politics of ethnicity? If so, how?
No, I wouldn't say so, because many countries in the world are diverse. India, China, America, Britain today. Diversity in itself is not a problem. So I've never felt that. I've just felt that you have to reflect the diversity of a country, the democratic rights, the human rights of everybody. And as I said in the podcast series, Burma got into this conflict trap where it couldn't solve the politics because of the conflict, and it couldn't solve the conflict because of the politics. It's not unusual. There are countries in the world like Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Syria. It's a terrible situation, and Burma is one of those countries. So I've always felt that as long as people could actually talk about the politics, that was all it ever was. The solutions should be there. And understanding the ethnic diversity was part of it. But I've never seen ethnic problems as the starting point for the problems. I actually see the central state, the Myanmar state, as the problem. The Myanmar state is divided. It was divided at independence between the communists and the socialists, and then it was between the military, and they went socialist, and the communists, and then UNU took up arms. And then in the last 30 years, you've had the Tatmadaw with its USDP, and you've got the NLD, and so on. What is happening is they are divided. And what tends to happen is you've got a division in the central state, and then the problems go out into the ethnic states, the ethnic areas, and they multiply because that's where the conflict is. And if you look at Karen state today, which side should Karen people be on? You've got the Burmese army, supporting BGFs and militias. You've got the KNU struggling for the rights of the Karen people. You've got splinter groups. This is the situation. The real problem is coming from the center. So the one thing I would say I've changed my view on is I did believe, and I don't think this was a wrong belief in the early 90s, after the events of 88, there was a generation of generals who realized they had to change. And they tried to open up the country. They had the election. And as we all know, General Than Shwe and the old guard weren't interested in change. So they stopped all of that. But I do believe that if you go back to those days, there was a possibility of dialogue. I met senior officers at that time who said, we know we're not going to win. We know we have to solve this politically. We know we have to work with the people. And unfortunately, they set up their own process, which was the National Convention, so they excluded a lot of people. So it was never going to work, and the result was the 2008 Constitution. It wasn't an answer. You almost had the same thing in the last decade with the NLD and President Thein Sein. They set up their process, but again, they excluded certain groups like Arakan, Ta'ang, Kachin. And of course, those groups are very strong now. They learnt their lessons. So you need an inclusive process. Well, why has an inclusive process not happened? And I would say that's where my view has changed. I do believe that the present Tatmadaw Sit-Tat leadership is the central problem. It might have seen itself as a solution back in the 50s when the politicians didn't solve the country, but it has grown into its own institution. It only cares about itself. And people call it a state within a state. I think it's far more than that. I do believe now there was a German political scientist in the 1930s, and he came up with the idea, Ernst Fraenkel, of a dual state. where you have a normative state, where you have Ministry of Health, Education, Justice. It can look normal to the outside world. And then you have the prerogative state, which is the military. And they do what they like. They can arrest people, they can kill people, they can do business deals. And foreigners don't see that. And I think for so long, even the Three Diseases Fund, and then the period after 2011, many of the foreigners who came to the country were looking at Burma as though it was a normal country, a normative state. As long as we just deal with the normal state, health, education, everything will change. What they didn't quite understand was the nature and character of the Tatmadaw and that prerogative state, and they're not interested at all in sharing power. And it's an ethnic Burma elite. It's, I would call it quasi-nationalist, I would almost call it fascist. It's got its trainings back in the Second World War from Imperial Japan, this ruthless way to treat civilian populations, how they, if they don't trust villagers, they'll burn the whole village down, they might kill people. This kind of behavior is so rampant now. As someone who's followed the country so long, I can't keep quiet about it. It's not a question of saying, well, there's a war and there are two sides in the war. We're looking at something systemic, which goes back to 1958, really, the first military caretaker administration, and it's refined itself. And we're now left with a group of generals who still seem to be thinking they can turn the country back to the past, even while things are falling down around them. And I think that's such a tragedy, because not every Burmese soldier's like this, not everyone in the Tatmadaw's like this, but they seem incapable of changing. And when I've asked them, why don't you change? They've said, our first lesson is you never surrender, you never back down. If you feel you're in a corner, you come out fighting. Well, that's what they're doing now. Nobody wants to fight. People want to solve the problems. What on earth are they doing? And that's why they're under investigation by the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, international human rights violations. This is a stain on the history of Burma. So if you say, if I change my view, it's because that issue of the Tatmadaw is much clearer than any before. And it's not simply just like foreign observers noticing this. This is what the Burmese people are showing and saying by their resistance, by their democratization, by the way they're working. It's very, very complicated. It's not going to be easy. But on the other hand, no one should be dying over issues which are political. And I believe, and I've written about this and talked about it now, that this tactic of maintaining conflict is what the generals do. They're not interested in solving it. They much prefer to create new militias, create new ceasefires, start fighting in certain areas and other. They've been doing it for 60, 70 years, and we can really see it clearly now. The military coup in 2021 was one of the most unnecessary coups in world history. And still now, I don't think the generals know why they took power except to have power.
Yeah. Some ethnic armed groups have joined the resistance to the 2021 coup and have stepped up attacks against the military. What do you think they want to achieve?
Well, the interesting thing is that the tactics have changed to the extent that many of them now say, well, we tried ceasefires, we tried dialogue, we tried the 2015 nationwide ceasefire agreement. And what we notice is every time we say, okay, we'll have a ceasefire and let's talk, they start waiting 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. After 1989, it took till 2008 for a new constitution. The nationwide ceasefire agreement was 2015. By 2021, nothing much had happened. So groups have learnt that the military use these as a delaying tactic. So the one change now is groups like the Arakan Army, the Ta'ang, KAO, KNU have gone back to it. They're occupying territory. They're saying, well, we're not going to wait. We're not only going to occupy territory, we're going to set up our own administrations. We're going to, we're going to get on with it. And then we're not only setting up our own administrations, we're going to set up models. Many of them call it federal. They use the word bottom up. They're not going to wait for anybody else to give it to them. So that is one of the interesting things. Now, that dynamic was there. It's always been there. It's not like liberated zones and mini-states are new. They've been there since 1948. What I would say is that there's greater vision, greater discussion, and I think a lot of these people from the CDM, the Generation Z, the younger people are much more interested in this than the previous generation. So you've now got kind of like a joining between some of the older ethnic armed organizations, which go back to the parliamentary era, the Karenni, Mon, Kachin, Karen, Pa'o, all go back that long. So we're talking about veteran organizations, and you've got this new influx in the modern world, and they're trying to make sure that Burma, Myanmar, is solving its problems for the 21st century. So you could say that the war in Burma is a 20th century war, but we're now in the 21st century. So is this going to be the generation which brings Burma into the 21st century? Because if there isn't unity, if there isn't a political solution, Burma is going to be so vulnerable internationally with its resources, with China and Thailand and India. There's many other countries very interested in what Burma has. And if the Burmese people themselves are not able to work together to solve these problems, well, there are going to be neighboring powers which exploit that and utilize it.
Could this be a turning point in Myanmar's long history of ethnic conflicts?
It's already been a turning point. Rather like 1988 was a turning point, because that brought to an end the Burmese way to socialism, and nothing was going to go back to that. 2021 has been a turning point in exposing the sort of things I've been talking about the nature of military rule, but also the potential for the country for change. And we're now 4 years down that road, and the military, they use time as a tactic. The longer they can delay things, the more they think they can change things to their advantage. But of course, that's not happening. They're losing territory. This is different. So again, there's a turning point. So the question is, will people in the military wake up at some stage soon and say, look, enough's enough. We're going to have to be our own turning point. And I can't see that at the moment, but that's the only way out. The Burmese people have made the turning point. There's no respect left for the Tatmadaw. There's no respect left for what they're doing, purely because they can't explain themselves. They only react with violence towards the people. The degree of cynicism where towns and villages are being bombed. It's not hurting the EAOs. They can deal with this kind of thing. You look at Iraq. America bombed Iraq, but they didn't destroy resistance on the ground. It doesn't work like that in war. But the civilians will suffer. And to think that in the 21st century, there is a country in Southeast Asia where the government, the military or the quasi-government, is bombing its own people on such scale. It's hard to fathom. You couldn't imagine this happening in Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia. You just couldn't imagine it. So how can this be happening in Burma? It really is something we should never get used to, because every day is a perpetration of gross human rights abuses.
Ethnic nationalities in Myanmar, including the Rohingya, have borne the brunt of the military's brutal crackdowns. Have most Myanmar people only come to realize this following the coup?
I don't think so. It's again one of these very difficult questions. When people go back to what happened in Europe, during the wars in the 20th century, very often people would say later, "Oh, we didn't know," and it's an easy way to get yourself out of a situation. I think maybe they knew something, but they didn't know just how deeply. And we're seeing this in the West right now. I don't want to make an easy comparison, but as we see the war in Europe, people can very quickly start taking sides without much thought. They forget that there's a commonality in the human suffering, and they sort of almost suggest, well, one side deserves it or one side's to blame. There's a lot of blaming of victims. It's an easy way. I think that what is true in the case of Burma, and I mentioned earlier the conflict trap. Conflict traps tend to happen only in ethnically diverse countries where there's one dominant ethnic group and a lot of smaller groups. Because that dominant ethnic group can act like a colonist. The British colonized Burma, and you could argue after the British left, the Burma elite, the politicians and the military, they sought to colonize the ethnic states. They never gave the freedoms and democratic rights promised under the Panglong Agreement, and the 47 Constitution didn't really deal with these issues. So you could say that collectively the central state of Burma and the elite there have never really understood it. I mean, I've had Burmese leaders say to me, "Oh, we understand the minorities, they're like our little brothers." And they don't realize how patronizing that is. That they don't even realize, with good intention, they're saying the very wrong thing. So I know I'm sitting on the fence on this one a bit, because I think genuinely people don't know things, and you can't hold everybody responsible. But I do think the political elite in Burma, the economic elite, the political elite, they've known very well. And that's why from time to time, you get like UNU, the former prime minister. He went into the Karen area, Mon area, and he formed his Parliamentary Democracy Party after he was thrown out, kicked out, arrested by Ne Win in the late 60s. He came, and actually, even though he was there, he had trouble agreeing on federalism with his ethnic allies. You know, he was still very reluctant to use the federalism word. So it's complicated, but I do think the younger generation today are very different in that sense. You know, they don't have those old prejudices. They understand much more through their own experience, not from the books, their own experience. They can see how the minorities are repressed. They can see it from their own experience. They now understand what's happening. So I think that's a question which has changed in context. At least I hope it has.
Myanmar has always been complex with many armed actors with similar acronyms. What do you think about all the new armed groups which have come together since the uprising to the coup?
Yes, it's kind of like conflict cycles. So there's always been these conflict cycles. The big ones were 48, 62, 88, and now 2021. And there's some commonality in each one where you have a new central government, you have a new permutation of resistance, and each time you have kind of united fronts between the different groups fighting the government. Back in the 50s, it was mainly the communists working with ethnic groups. After 62, you had both the communists and the UNU's group. After 88, you had people from the NLD, the NCGUB, who formed a parallel government, the NCUB as well. And after 2021, we've got the NUG. So you get these patterns. I think one difference is the extent to which the ethnic groups in this new permutation have stepped up their own struggles. And they've done it in a ways which took many people by surprise. If we go back just a decade, the Tatmadaw was saying, oh, we don't need to include the Arakan Army or the Taang National Liberation Army or the Kokang. You know, they're nothing, they're small groups, you know, we've defeated them, they don't count. And now they're, you know, amongst the strongest groups in the country. So that doesn't happen by chance. It happens because they've got popular support. It happens because the people feel excluded. And there's a strong lesson for the military and anybody in Burma. Don't ignore people. You know, if you don't ignore people and they're struggling and suffering, you know, Arakan is not just the Rohingya, the Rakhine. It should be one of the most prosperous regions in Southeast Asia, let alone in Burma. And it's become one of the poorest. So something's gone very wrong since independence. So I think that is one of the dynamics. The ethnic groups are much stronger now. You've got these new models, like in Kachin State, Karenni, forming forming federal councils. They're trying to network, not simply as ethnic armed groups. They're trying to network with civil society groups, political parties, and other groups to form their own administration. So that is a very interesting phenomena. And then you have the question that many people always talk about is the NUG. Well, the NUG is another element in the struggle. It's very easy to criticize groups for not being successful, but who is being successful in Burma? It goes on year after year, the strain, the stress, the determination, and the human loss, the suffering. I mean, just to give us statistics, without wanting to be melodramatic, it's often forgotten that Burma today is on the same page of conflict, division, and humanitarian emergency as Ukraine, or Syria, or Sudan, and even Gaza, Palestine. We're talking about over 4 million refugees and IDPs. We're talking about over 20,000 political prisoners. We're talking about half the population living in poverty. And then we've got maybe over 20,000 people who've died in the conflict zones. Over 6,000 civilians have been killed by the security services. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So this is a terrible situation which people are struggling to survive. And really, the international community, as we're seeing generally in the world, has gone to sleep. The United Nations has had a special envoy on Burma since 1992. And yet 30 years plus later, we have to ask, what cohesion, what effect is the United Nations bringing to the country today? What cohesion, what effect is ASEAN bringing to the country? We're always hearing about a new name, someone's going to save it, they have a new plan. Well, it's like they're learning nothing. It's like everybody arrives and think, oh, well, now I've arrived. I'm going to change things. There's an old joke, Tom Stoppard, who was a British playwright. He said, with foreign journalists, the most important thing in any foreign news story, in their view, is their arrival to report it. And I feel this is how the international community face Burma. The minute somebody arrives, they think, oh, we're here, we're going to solve this, and it looks to them a glittering prize. They don't realize that the Burmese people are struggling to solve it. There are ways to solve it, and it can be done, but it needs a much more cohesive and understanding international effect.
Thank you for joining me in the DVB Newsroom today, Martin.
Thank you, you're welcome.